www.tumultuous.org. At this time, I'd like to ask you to silence anything that you have that makes noise, but please feel free to tweet, and our hashtag is MCNYLive. And I would now like to introduce our speakers for the evening. Andrea Aranow has created fashion and studied textiles since the late 1960s. She opened Dakota Transit in 1967, a custom leather and snakeskin apparel shop in the East Village, and she achieved instant fame with the snakeskin collage clothes she made for Jimi Hendrix. Aranow spent 15 years abroad creating ethnic textile collections, and she now works as an independent consultant. Originally from Detroit, designer Anna Sui has been a force on the New York and global fashion scene since the 1990s. Known for combining vintage styles with currently popular cultural obsessions, Sui premiered her first runway show in 1991 and opened her first flagship store in 1992 in Soho. She has since expanded into cosmetics and fragrances and now has over 65 stores worldwide. Phyllis Magidson is the Elizabeth Farron Tozer Curator of Costumes and Textiles, where she oversees the museum's permanent collection of over 27,000 costumes and accessories. She's the co-curator with Donald Albrecht of Mod New York Fashion Takes a Trip. And recent previous exhibitions include Gilded New York and Stephen Burrows, When Fashion Danced. And last but not least, our moderator tonight is Dr. Hazel Clark. She teaches fashion studies and design studies in the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons. She holds a PhD in design history. Her scholarship has focused on uncovering new perspectives, cultures, and geographies for the study of fashion and design in the United States, Europe, and China. Won't you please join me in welcoming this very distinguished panel?
So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction, Fran. That was really welcoming. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here with three women that I'm a big fan of, so it's great to have a conversation with them. But first, just to think about the context of the conversation, as Fran said, the city is celebrating America in the 1960s. In fact, the world seems to be celebrating America in the 1960s. There have been exhibitions for the last couple of years. There was a show called You Say You Want a Revolution at the V&A last year and the year before. There's a show of the same name, actually, at the moment at the New York Public Library. The Schomburg Center has Power in Print, the art of the Black Power movements. Philadelphia Museum has got Design in a Revolution, a 1960s Odyssey, and it goes on and on. So I think for those in the audience for whom the 60s is either a myth and for those that it's a reality, there's maybe different ends of the perspective. And I'd love us to really to share that sometimes more mythic quality of the 1960s, and really just what was so special and revolutionary about that time, and why 50 years on it's now really a cause for celebration and reflection. So that's the context for our conversation this evening, obviously, as well as the exhibition upstairs. But the other thing about, of course, the exhibition upstairs, it's about mod, but it's also Mod New York. And I'm conscious I'm sitting on this stage with, I'm sure, three other people like myself who would declare ourselves New Yorkers, and yet we're all transplants from other places, and I'm sure that applies to many people in the audience. So I'd like to start really with that as a question to Andrea and to Anna about what drew you originally to New York?
In my case, New York was the Mecca where people dressed. When I visited for a day trip from Massachusetts or Providence, where I was at college, and I went to the Museum of Modern Art, it was to see what people were wearing. How about you, Anna?
I think growing up in Detroit, in the suburbs, the world that was going on seemed so far away. especially in New York, where there were people like Andy Warhol, all these heroes. And I think that part of why I came to New York was to meet my heroes and to kind of enjoy the arts and what was going on, the nightlife, all those things like seems so exotic, so exciting. And it was just always my dream. I actually, since I was 4 years old, to move to New York.
Yeah, I think New York has a lot. I'm going to ask Phyllis as well, because I know you had the same attraction.
Oh, I was attracted because I grew up on the Upper West Side, and I was always here. But the thing about it was that I was 3 blocks away from Zabar's. I was 3 blocks away from everything, and you were constantly encountering extraordinary people, whether they were performers or eccentrics who were standing selling peacock feathers in front of Alexander's and going, very, very, very cheap. You know, I mean, that was part of, it was the flavor. The abnormal was the normal. So, you know, I just really breathed into it and you know, it was always part of me. I was always part of it.
Okay, so that gives us a good segue into talking a bit about certainly fashion and how New York has been this place that people look at each other, still is on the streets, in the museums, etc. So I'd like to start a bit more specifically asking Andrea about her shop. This wonderful shop we have a picture of in what we now call the East Village, but then I don't think was called the East Village. The store was called Dakota Transit. So maybe you can give us a little bit about the history and background. I know it started in 1969, so it was at the very end of the 60s, but it seemed to be very, what we would call very 60s in spirit.
Yeah, I think it planted right at the right time. And it was a total accident because my boyfriend, later my husband, said there is not enough room for all these sewing machines here. There's an empty storefront around the corner. You don't have to do a business there. And of course, this empty storefront had a window, and it was an organic thing. Something went in the window, someone walked through the door. And I loved being on the street and just conversations being spontaneous. So first people came in, then we talked, then they liked something, then they had an idea, and it grew from there. I had no idea of being a fashion designer or running a business. I just wanted to make these special clothes that I had thought of.
And it was on St. Mark's Place?
It was on East 9th Street.
East 9th, yeah. And I'm right in thinking that the East Village wasn't the East Village then, was it? It wasn't a named cool location.
Oh, I think we thought we were pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I meant the geography, that's all, the mapping. Yeah. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about, with both of you, about this concept of the boutique and the small store, because I was conscious with some of my students last week talking about, this whole, and as I write in the book of the exhibition, this whole new way of shopping that the boutique was about. And you've just started to touch on it, Andrea, which was a place of like meeting people and conversation rather than going in to buy something and you knew what you wanted to buy beforehand. So would either of you like to say more about the kind of the boutique as place? Maybe Anna.
I think that was like right at the beginning of like pret-a-porter, and suddenly there were designers opening their own shops, creating their own worlds. And I started seeing it in magazines and hearing stories about stores like Biba that we were talking about.
Yeah.
When I moved to New York, there was a small block, 53rd Street, that had Betsy Bunky and Nini, Norma Kamali, and there was one woman that made clothing out of scarves. There was another woman that did kind of like, she was Japanese and she did things out of Japanese fabrics. And it was so unique. It wasn't a department store. It wasn't a mall, like places that like I knew so well from Detroit. It was suddenly these little worlds that you would wander into. And I think that was always my dream, is to have my own shop like that with my own world.
Did you feel you were creating a world, Andrea?
Yeah, it seemed very there were a lot of walls there. The only time I saw other fashion was because some of my clients were going to other cool stores. It's not because I got to visit them myself.
So what were the other cool stores?
Oh, there were a couple in LA and a couple in London, and there were like 7 or 8 stores, and there were some in our neighborhood. And I guess all of us were really fervent about creating at that time, because there was a lot of care and a lot of handwork. And in the case of my shop, where we were making clothes out of snakeskin that had to be very, very well fitted, we'd see a client 4 or 5 times during the process of the garment. So, yeah, we were invested together.
So we put one of the pieces up here. Can you tell us something about these pieces?
So on the left, that's the first suit I ever made completely out of snakeskin. At the very start, I was buying suede and adorning the garments with snakeskin. But I had the skin sort of loped over the back of a chair when Jimi Hendrix came in. And he looked at those and said, I think I need a suit completely out of snakeskin. So that's the very first one. And it was good.
Yeah, I love the client-driven bit. That's great. What about this one?
Yeah, I only did this for a few years, and the pieces kept getting more and more elaborate. I started collecting many, many colors of cobras, particularly glazed cobras, and working them into patchworks. You know, once I had 100 colors, the mosaic element of the clothes became quite important. So this was a grand cape lined with marigold suede, very heavy, but it was purchased by Betty Davis, and she, if anybody, was the one to carry it off.
So everything you were making custom for your clients?
If I had a lull in an idea, I'd make something and put it up in the window or have it in the shop, and then someone would say, I like that, but green would suit me better, or we'd modify. So it came both ways.
What about you, Anna? I mean, has that client relationship been sort of inspiring for you and important in your work?
Yeah, I think that before I had my own boutique, I was already selling stores. Because like the first customers that I had were big department stores, actually. Like I did a small collection of 5 pieces and sold at the boutique show, because I had 2 friends, this is during the punk days, and they did the most incredible jewelry out of vintage findings. And I thought they were just the coolest couple. So I said, oh, I'd love to do that too. And they said, well, why don't you make some clothes? And I did, and I sold it at the boutique show. But I got orders from Macy's and Bloomingdale's, which were the 2 fashion stores at that moment. And consequently, I got fired from my job because I had my own New York Times ad and Christmas windows at Macy's.
Yeah, I think people getting fired is sometimes significant in a good way. I'm just going to, there's a few more of your pieces, Andrea. What about this one?
That's a waistcoat I did for Miles Davis. And he was pretty bright in his backyard, had this big tin hanging. And we just sat out in the sun, and it was a nice afternoon.
So you had a lot of clients who were musicians. You were around the corner from the Fillmore East, is that right?
I was near the Fillmore East, and I didn't have a lot of famous musician clients, but I had a lot of clients who wanted to be seen. And those included some musicians, for sure.
Okay, and I think we've got, this is more recent work. Maybe tell us about this.
Yeah, the color things has stayed with me. After I did Dakota Transit, I started another part of my career where I was collecting textiles in faraway lands. I took the exoticism thread of the 60s very literally. It wasn't that I wanted to think about Morocco or burn incense from Morocco. I wanted to go there and live there. So I did that. Not Morocco, but Peru, and later Asia, China, Japan. But very recently, last winter, I took an old fantasy of mine. I'd studied lots of kimonos, and I learned how to fold them and keep them straight and stand up straight and wear obi. But I always had this dream about kimonos just flying free, nothing straight about them. So we concocted a fashion show at the Ace Hotel, and we made, from washi paper, we made kimonos that could float. And we did a catwalk here at the Ace last February. It was quite fun.
And there's one more slide from you, which kind of links the present and the past in a beautiful way.
My old friend Betsy showed up for that evening, so it was a complete circle. It's fun, and we keep having fun, right?
Yeah. So just before we lose that point, tell us about how you chose the name of the shop, because I know at the same time in the 60s there were lots of little boutiques in New York and other places, but in New York there was Paraphernalia and Abracadabra and Teeny Weeny and Limbo, all with kind of very unusual names. So how did Dakota Transit come about?
Well, we just brainstormed, three of us, a day or two. And you're right, the names were whimsical, and the band names were very whimsical. And I particularly liked Dakota Transit because of the form of the letters. I wanted to use that old Art Deco style type. Wide letters look good. Yeah, for me, Dakota's like the end of the world.
Like New York was for a lot of people at the time. Yeah, maybe Anna, we've got some of your pieces next. I think we obviously from a recent collection,
Yeah.
but perhaps you can just say a little bit about
Sure.
these.
You know, I've always been influenced by the 60s, but this was really the first complete collection that I did that was totally inspired by the 60s. And I had seen a lot of those exhibitions that you were talking about. Say You Want a Revolution, Summer of Love, and then the Counter Couture show. And I just thought, okay, this is the moment to do it. And especially in the Counter Couture show, there was a video of a procession at a commune. And I just loved like the blueness of it because the way it was filmed and the way the old film kind of, the color changed. The procession of like father with all his wives. There were just like all these things that I wanted to capture. So we opened the show in the dark with just like very, very soft lighting, and every model in the show walked through. And there were kids in the show too, my niece and nephew, and then a friend of mine's children, and just couples and groups, and so I just loved that feeling. So that kind of very stylized procession. So that this is the opening of the show. This was almost at the end, and you can see that there's very kind of artisanal fabrics involved, which was another thing that I'm missing. I'm missing like the human touch on fabrics. Like people love digital this, 3D printed this. I love seeing that like a person has touched it. And I think you can see like the velvet is hand painted. I met this incredible woman, Noelle, and she did the kind of resist print t-shirts. She did some motifs for us. And
I'll go back to this one.
these were all hand painted by Sarah Mitchell that it works in the design department in my office, but she's a great artist, and she hand painted these pieces. And then the trimming on all this are textiles from Peru, similar to the belt that you just showed me. And James Coviello, that I've always worked with since the beginning, makes the sweaters down in Peru, and I asked him to go down to the marketplace, and he was sending me pictures from the market, and we picked out textiles and used them as trimming or did belts. Actually, the capes in the beginning were made out of blankets that we overdyed to get like the colors, so they kind of had a more vintage sort of look to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something. I mean, there's lots of things that potentially link you both together, but certainly your love of textiles and embellishment and surface and color, which we see in this collection. Yeah. But I mean, what? It's very interesting because you have slightly different sort of time perspectives on the 60s. So Anna, what attracted you to the 60s style. I was saying before we came on stage, I was at the opening of your wonderful show in London last year, and there were the opening was full of 60s icons like Twiggy and Zandra Rhodes, but they're all sort of friends of yours and people you know they're real people, they're not just myths.
But I think as a kid growing up, those were my idols, and those were the people that I saved all their pictures. I kind of really aspired to like the way they dressed. It really influenced, I think, my whole design sense, and to be able to actually meet them was just, it's such a treasure to meet these people. But I think that also, the 60s to me was a period of longing, dreaming, fantasizing about what life could be. And I think that that's what we all love so much about the 60s, is the fact that there was so much possibility. We all thought there was so much possibility, that things were going to change, that finally it was going to be no more war. We were going to have peace. We were going to have kind of utopia. Like all those things were themes that the 60s were about. And I guess that's why, to me, that's still my favorite period, the fact that there was that possibility.
Do you feel the same, Andrea?
Many of the points I feel the same, but I would add that there was this tremendous self-consciousness about youth being heard. People our age were speaking up and other people were listening. And then, of course, when the press dipped into it, that was like a confirmation, because I didn't know any fashions from Paris or new shapes across the world. It was like editor at Harper's or Vogue would call me and say, well, we think hot pants would be good for this year. Make some, Okay, the shapes, they had to tell me what to do. The surfaces and the materials is what I love to play with, but I would have been lost. I was lost frequently, but it was enjoyable.
Phyllis, can you say a little bit about this term youthquake as well, which we've used for tonight, and its origins?
Okay, well, youthquake really, it was a moment. It was the January 1, 1965 issue of Vogue, and Mrs. Freeland, in her inimitable way, invented a word, and it has resonated obviously since then, to the point where this past year it was the word of the year, having a slightly different meaning, but it was really kind of a call to arms to the fashion industry, that there was a youth culture that was really blossoming abroad in England, in France, and America was way behind. And she was just saying, hey, look, this is this market, this tremendous 93 million strong, and we better get on the ball here or we're going to miss out. And suddenly everything starts happening. That September, Paraphernalia Boutique opens on Madison Avenue, which is revolutionary in the amount of attention that it commanded. It was not just a fashion event, it was an art event, it was a music event. It kind of took the best of everything, and it became a hangout. It became a place where retail, historically, you had gone in to buy a garment. You had gone in to buy something. Paraphernalia was a hangout. You could socialize there, you could stay. They were open until midnight. And it just woke up. If Mrs. Vreeland's editorial piece had not done so, the whole success of Paraphernalia, the notoriety of Paraphernalia, certainly was able to accomplish that.
And what about actually, Andrea, running the store in the 60s? I mean, what were the sort of challenges and the triumphs and, getting the clothes made and selling them?
I didn't think about this much at the time. 50 years later, I can say, oh, yeah, we thought we were so special and revolutionary, but actually there was a pattern going. And one aspect of it, which I don't think young kids understand too well now, is it was so affluent in the 60s. America was affluent. Mm-hmm. We kids, even though we were just in our 20s, we thought we could quit a job and go away and come back and find another job. And that was very different from now. So it gave us a lot of latitude.
And the store wasn't open all the time, was it?
Oh, I used to close my store for a month in the summer.
How much was your rent?
The rent was pretty low, and we were able to rent a second adjacent storefront that they joined in the back. Then I had that place up on 53rd, as you mentioned. But yeah, the costs were low. But I was pretty definite that I wanted the people working with me, and we weren't many, we were 5 or 6, to get away, to get out of New York, to get, far away, to have a month to do something completely different. And me too, I definitely wanted to travel. So one summer I did a stage, an internship at Réveillon in Paris. Very big, wide eyes working at Réveillon. That was quite a change from East 9th Street. And then another summer I went down to Peru. And yeah, that's where I fell in love with the mountains, which started the second chapter.
Oh, and is that what ended the first chapter?
It did, yeah. New York was, for me, after 4 or 5 years in the center of this frenzy, was getting too stressful. There were too many drugs around, and it wasn't quite so much fun repeating it.
And Anna, what about you when you decided to open a store and chose the location? I mean, what influenced the time, the place?
It's really interesting. A friend of mine that always worked at Calvin Klein, Zach Carr, lived on the same block that I did. And every time he saw me, he's like, we've got to get together. We've got to talk. And I finally had dinner with him. And I was struggling at that point because stores didn't know where to put me. Because for designer departments, I didn't sit next to Bill Blass and Calvin Klein. Like it was something different going on. Eventually, the ideal vehicle for my clothing was something like Barney's Co-op, which became the beginning of the contemporary area. But he said, you know what you have to do? You have to open a boutique. If you created your own world, people would get you. The next day I walked down to Soho, and it was at a point when Soho was kind of like at a lull, like the galleries had moved out. There were a lot of empty spaces. The rents were not very high. And I got the store on Green Street, which we had a 20-year lease, and the rent was really low, and that was kind of like what created everything. And once I opened that store, it just generated so much attention that stores gave me a department that looked like that. We would build it. I would find the vintage furniture. I would find the fake Tiffany lamps, like all those things. They wanted to create that environment.
So tell us a bit more about choosing that store aesthetic to begin with, and how the relationship between the store aesthetic and the collections. And you could have made lots of choices, but it's very distinctive.
I think that it was when I walked in the store, I thought I could picture what it was going to look like. It just had a look to me, and I think that I was always very inspired by Biba. I loved the fact that the darkness of the store, the graphics of the store. So I wanted to create my own version of that. And right before that, I had moved into an office where I originally started my business in my apartment, which was kind of a loft apartment. And when we moved the business out, my friend Stephen Meisel and Paul Cavaco were over, and I was on the phone with the contractor. Oh yeah, make the floors blonde, just sand them and make them blonde. And Stephen's like, wait a minute, get off the phone. You're not having a blonde floor. And he said, okay, what color would Vreeland have? And I'm like, red. He said, okay, that's going to be it. You're going to have a red floor. So I decided, okay, for the boutique, I had to have the red floor. My favorite color since childhood was lavender. So I thought, okay, lavender walls. And then since I moved to New York, or actually even when I was in high school, whatever furniture I would drag home from the Salvation Army, I would always paint shiny black. So I thought, okay, shiny black furniture. And that became my signature. Those colors kind of became icons of my brand. And kind of everything in the store, the type of furniture that I chose, the imagery, the butterflies, the rock posters, all those things, became icons of the brand.
Yeah, really powerful. You mentioned this wonderful store in London, which called Bieber, which also sort of started in the early '60s, and it actually started with a small gingham frock being advertised in been sold through one of the British newspapers, and then morphed. But by the end of the '60s, had this wonderful sort of Art Nouveau, Art Deco vibe. But I also wanted to ask you and maybe, well, all of you, but maybe Phyllis too, about that sense of Britain, and that's, in 1964, obviously the Beatles came to New York. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show. Everyone knew about them. But that sense of the British invasion, and whether there was the sense either earlier in the '60s or later of an influence, and what it was. Obviously, we've not talked about music. Music was a strong part of this, the times.
There was something wonderfully exotic about Great Britain. It wasn't.
No, there wasn't.
To our perspective, it was.
Depends where you're standing.
When the Beatles hit, the Ed Sullivan Show, my gosh, it was everybody was walking around with a British accent, and and there were already models and styles in the major fashion publications that had infiltrated in there without really a lot of announcement. There, you saw Patty Boyd was in there. You saw Jean Shrimpton. You saw beginnings of that kind of long, shaggy hair on women and men. White stockings, snub-toed shoes, the postures for women going from the Kennedy era, where there was this tremendous sophistication and formality of presentation, and all of a sudden you're seeing little kids in children's poses with Twiggy and some of the other models. Everybody wanted to be there. It was different, and I think that being different was very appealing, especially coming out of the Kennedy era, and there were very sad connotations to that era. So this was the real beginning, I think, of escapism for the youth culture in New York, especially.
What about you, Anna? Any thoughts on British invasion?
Yeah, I was fighting with my brother. I wanted to watch the Beatles. He wanted to watch the ball game, and somehow I won. And he never let me forget that he missed the ball game. But I think it changed our world. It was like the four such cute guys with long hair and these great suits and those Beatle boots, and it was just a whole different thing. Growing up in Detroit, every band came through, and the first bands I saw were Iggy and the Stooges, MC5, but you waited for those British bands, because they had the beautiful clothes and their girlfriends' clothes on, or beautiful girlfriends with the mini dresses and all of that, the shaggier sort of hair. And in fact, Jean Shrimpton came through Detroit, and I saw it in the newspaper, and I asked my mom, can we go down to downtown Detroit and can we go see Jean Shrimpton? And she was traveling for Yardley. And I remember I had never seen anybody like that. Because first of all, in America, we grew up with Breck hair, shiny, polished hair. And here was Jean Shrimpton with this kind of shaggy hair. And she was so pale and white and so tall and skinny with the shortest mini skirt. I'd never seen anything like it. It was just kind of an Abiba shirt with the big billowy sleeves. And it was the most exotic thing I ever saw. And then there was Twiggy after that, which again was so extreme from the corn-fed models that we were used to here.
Yeah, exactly. Andrea, were you aware of British influences at all in the East Village?
Not so much. Not so much specifically British. It was more the cross-cultural, restaurants, food, music. For sure, I was aware of it musically, but clothes-wise, not so much. It was mixed.
I think it's interesting. I think Phyllis used the term exotic. Obviously, exotic means different things to different people, but obviously also in the 60s, when people were starting to travel more, and I was talking when I was talking to Fran before this talk about in the UK, you could literally go from Britain overland to India, which today is, I mean, and as many decades has been impossible. You know, you can go through Afghanistan, you could go through Iran, and, you know, through Nepal, down to Goa, and if you wanted, even to Bangkok. So, I mean, I think that's also something, of course, we see in this collection, particularly of yours, Anna, and also in Andrea's influence since in textiles, that sense of that just cultural richness. Would you like to say anything more about that?
I think that the 60s kind of opened up the world because there was that chance, that the opportunity to travel. I think people did not travel as much before that. And suddenly there were all these cheap flights, especially after the whole British invasion. Like you could fly to London for like $99, I think. And once you started seeing things like the Beatles wearing those beautiful sheepskin coats with all the embroidery, or Stevie Winwood, or like any of those bands, it was like, oh, you gotta have it, you gotta have it. And the jewelry from India, when the Beatles met the Maharishi, like all those things were just so exotic at that point, like because the world was such a much bigger place. But it gave you that idea of a dream to, like, that's where you want to go, that's what you want to see, and you could go to London and find it. You know, it was there in like Portobello or in different shops there. Yeah. I think Christopher Gibb was one of the first people to travel and buy those sheepskin jackets and bring them back to London. And
yeah, where they were always called Afghan jackets because that was their origin.
There
yeah.
were the Afghani pieces that were coming from Afghanistan as well, and interestingly, they found their way into boutiques like Paraphernalia, but they also made their way into Saks Fifth Avenue, into little in-store boutiques. And the thing about the department stores in New York was that all of a sudden they were scrambling not to lose ground, and you know, invariably each of the stores opened a boutique, and each one had a very kind of specific flavor, but there were a lot of things coming in from Afghanistan, and that's when the vest, and even the vests make their way onto the cover of Vogue. In the only fold-out cover that they ever did was an Afghani vest.
Yeah, and of course, just talking about the like the covers of magazines and fashion magazines. I mean, the beginning also of African American models on the cover of magazines. So also recognizing, I think, in America that at last the diversity of the country. Obviously, this was the time of civil rights movement as well. So that sense at home of the world, the changed, different world being recognized. Yeah.
I think in America we didn't have the same background as you Brits, who had colonialism, and going to certain countries was just normal because people went back and forth.
For wealthy people. Yeah.
The wealthy people or the enslaved military people. But we explored our own backyard from America too. Of course. Going to Mexico or going to South America, or just these little one-off trips like to North Africa. Yeah. So it was also, we were going out and exploring. Yeah, yeah. Cool mix. It was fun.
Yeah. Maybe we've got some slides from the exhibition, and I don't know whether we talked about your pieces. Yeah. Maybe we can just have a word about the exhibition, Phyllis, and also before you talk about these pieces. I mean, we know that the 60s wasn't just one thing. I mean, there was lots of different styles and things going on in the 60s. But you call the show Mod New York, even though you actually, you go from the 60s right into the 70s. So why did you choose the name Mod New York?
Well, it kind of implied it's beyond what the British recognized as the mod movement, which was basically male initiated, but there was a coolness again to modernism, to a whole modernistic approach to something that was iconoclastic, and I think that that's really the meaning of the word for the exhibition, where we were looking at how to really evolve the exhibition, and again, there were so many exhibitions that opened during the summer and last year that were focusing on the counterculture and the bohemianism. And I really wanted to be certain to show that it wasn't all that it was an evolutionary process. And in effect, it was a trip You know, you start out in this totally neutral tones where very conservative, neutral tone stockings, perfect hair, perfect makeup, protocol, bags, gloves, and all of a sudden something's going on. And there's, you know, yes, the Kennedy assassination did have an impact. Everybody was totally shocked. And amazingly, they were able to pull out of it as the Beatles stepped off the plane at the airport, and it launched the next era. And there was a bit of embitterment, there was an escalation of the war in Vietnam, and it just kind of, and modernism certainly makes its way into the space age, you know, collection of Courrèges and some of the other modernist designers. So it's really more in that sense. And with going into from the Youthquake era to dropping a little acid in there, and all of the patterns are morphing around, and it kind of coincides with the music and the youth culture, and it peaks. And it peaks and starts coming down again right around 1970. And in the exhibition, we have this amazing issue of Vogue, September 1970, where you have pages devoted to Giorgio di San Angelo and tribalism, and Naomi Sims in braids, and all of these patterns. And then 2 pages later, you've got Lauren Hutton in Halston, which is the complete antithesis of that. And that's the moment where you're doing the paste up and there's the slip sheet. You know, you've got one kind of coming, you know, it's gone as far as it could go. It's kind of getting to a point where, whoop, it goes over to the other side, and you come back down again, and the colors calm down, the patterns calm down, the hair comes off, the makeup refines itself, and you go into this next phase, which is really, yes, it's impacted by the women's liberation movement, women readying themselves to really take a position of authority in the workforce, and the credibility of, you have to look the part a little bit, so suits come in, pantsuits come in, and you go on to the next phase, which is really into the 70s, and you know, it's what we call the new nonchalance, which was really Grace Mirabella's term that she explores in an editorial in 72. And everything then goes logistically back to solid colors, Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, more conservative again. You know, it's all pendulum swing. And you see it very definitely in the exhibition.
But I think what you've said, and you know what we've heard from Anna and Andrea, that the 60s didn't just break the mode; it really smashed it to smithereens.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
So tell us about the images on
Right.
this.
Well,
this
I
screen.
just kind of picked out a few of the pieces that were from the New Bohemian section of the exhibition, because those were the most revolutionary in contesting all of the previous rules of fashion, where you have no fit, you have no construction, you have experimentation with ethnic pieces of clothing, mixing and matching. You know, even some of the earlier designers who did capsule collections, modular collections, Bonnie Cashin, where the concept of mixing and matching, well, in this New Bohemia era, you're not even matching, you're just mixing randomly, and there are no rules, so everything goes together. And there's tie-dyeing and all of the other, the cultural influences, where there's applique, where there's embroidery, where there's patchwork, where there's everything that you could possibly do, and bleaching and denim, and it's all there concurrently. So, I chose this piece. This is one of the Giorgio di San Angelo pieces, but I think that the first time I saw this dress, I thought it was one of the ugliest things I'd ever seen. And it's got it's a synthetic. Synthetic was wonderful. It was modern. It was washable. And you could throw it out because it wasn't very expensive. But all of those things of respecting your wardrobe. This is an amazing piece. This is Jeffrey Bean. And when we first brought it into the collection, I dated it because it was resist die as late 60s, and which was totally plausible. And then when we were working on researching the exhibition, Jeffrey Bean's first Cody Award collection was 1964, and it was this piece. So there were certain people who were already predicting what was going to happen. But all of these techniques, and again, Paisley,
That's
everybody
wonderful.
loved Paisley, and metallics and all of this stuff. And this kind of faded away briefly, but it keeps coming back, and it keeps back, comes back incrementally, and somebody revives Paisley, and somebody revives tie-dye, and it all looks fresh and it looks new because it was then, and it will always be, because it's just, something that's new to the eye is new. It doesn't matter historically. And also, thrift shop clothing, the counterculture not wanting to invest in the military industrial. So that's kind of where we are with the show.
Thank you. I wanted just to pick up something you said and ask Anna. Phyllis talked about fashion rules. Do you feel that you've had to stay within rules while breaking rules, or could you say anything about designing to rules? I mean, how do rules apply? Or have they applied or not?
Well, it seems that everything that was wrong looks right. And I think that that's kind of the rule, is that, don't wear white shoes in the winter. And suddenly, like, everyone's wearing white shoes in the winter. It's just, rules are made to be broken. So I think that that's part of what's, it's that same pendulum thing where if you get too used to it, it gets too normal, and then you kind of don't notice it. So it's going to swing completely the opposite way, and the most extreme way. Like the way it went from how Phyllis was describing, like the very kind of ethnic dressing, and suddenly there was like ultra suede taupe pieces, shirt dresses.
Yeah.
It's like.
Yeah. So we should allow some time for some questions, but before we do that, I'd just like to maybe bring us up to date. And Andrea, ask you to talk a little bit first about Textile Hive and what you've been doing in recent years, other than the lovely fashion show you talked about, and your like ongoing interest in and incredible knowledge of textiles.
Yes, it's still being answered, all my textile questions. So when I finished up with the East Village, I moved to Peru, to the highlands, for 5 years, and that was where I first began to do serious textile collecting for museums. So I stayed in Peru, I made a big collection, talked about its development, changes in materials, meaning of symbols. And that collection went to the British Museum.
Wow.
And then I started looking at Asia. I did a small trip to Afghanistan, to Laos, to Burma, and I came across the news that the long forbiddenly closed China was opening to independent travel.
Wow.
So after a few brief trips, I took my kids away from school for a year, and we traveled around the perimeters of China to minority villages collecting traditional costume for a whole year. That was amazing. And then Japan for 3 years. My parents thought my kids should go back into school, so I figured Japan was pretty close by. And that's where I started learning about kimono in depth. And finally, in '87, I came back to New York with all this swatches that I'd collected to study. And I opened a new business called Textile Documents, which for 25 years collected and presented to designers new ideas for prints and for textile fabrics. So I worked with fashion people, home furnishings, carpets, wall coverings. And at the end of 25 years or so, I had 40,000 pieces. My digital son looked at this stuff and said, "Okay, Mom, stop buying. I'm going to put this collection in order." And he with a brilliant staff, took these 40,000 pieces, photographed each one, tagged them, and created an app for finding and locating them, which is called Textile Hive. So I'm back to just frittering around doing consulting, and it's quite good. I got back from a trip to Japan for Uniqlo a few weeks ago, and I like talking about textiles still.
That's great. Yeah. And Anna, I know that obviously Japan's been important to you, but maybe you can just talk about, we left off when you were in Soho in one store, but since then you've got a little bit bigger and a bit more global. So tell us about the challenges of that as well as the opportunities of it becoming global, basically.
I think in the early 90s, New York Fashion Week became globally important. Everyone was looking for New York designers, and I think it was a matter of being in the right place at the right time. And consequently, Isetan, the department store, came to me and wanted to distribute my clothing. Along with that, I got 12 licenses, which included the cosmetics license. So I think that all of that made it possible for me to go global. I was also freelancing a lot in Italy because I needed money to support my collection. So for 7 years, back and forth, every couple weeks, I was doing freelance work. But it opened up my eyes to the possibility that I could go anywhere and work. I never learned Japanese or Italian, but I still worked in those countries. And kind of the world was also getting global. I think that now for a designer, what they really need to do is think of not just designing where they live, where are coming to New York to work. I think there's so much possibility now in Asia. That's where all the kind of technical revolution is going on. I think they've taken digital with laces and printing and all that to the farthest extent. It's amazing what they've been able to do. So it's really a global time right now, and I'm really thankful that my mind was opened up enough to be able to kind of make that step forward.
And what about from each of you, just to finish off, about the role of fashion now compared to the 60s? I mean, maybe Phyllis, you'd like to start?
Oh goodness, I think that, certainly I think back of times when designers would present collections and there would be sketchers there from abroad who would sketch what was being shown and immediately try and translate it back into something back in America if it was Paris, whereas now it's instantaneous. Everything is happening so quickly, and it is absolutely a global language of fashion. There is nothing that is restricted to a specific country, or it's all, again, it's more of a blend now than it was in the late 60s, because you don't even think twice about it. It's all part of this master global vocabulary of clothing. And everybody is willing to, it's not even experimental anymore. It's just part of the way that we think about clothing. It's mood, there are no restrictions. Everything is totally open, which is kind of interesting because it really kind of begs the question of where are we going? What is this going to be? What is new? What is the future holding? It's a question, I think, for all of us.
Andrea, what about you? Would you think fashion is as creative now as in the 60s? The people you were watching at the Museum of Modern Art, for example?
Well, now I look everywhere, not just at the museum. So when you talk about fashion, I'm wondering, do you mean commercial fashion or actually what people are wearing?
Well, I think that's the point. Yeah, I mean both.
I like looking at what people are wearing and the way they choose things, whether they're spending hours choosing which obi to wear with their kimono or which rickrack to put on their pollera and peru. I think people still love dressing, and they like the fact that expresses who they are.
Exactly, yeah. Anna, how about fashion now compared to the 60s?
Well, I think that with the globalization, fashion became kind of the same everywhere. It used to be you went to London because there was a London look. You went to Paris and it was completely different. Japan, certainly, like there was the Harajuku, and now it seems like everybody dresses very, very much the same. It's all that kind of athleisure thing. Like think about it. Like when you went to the airports 25 years ago, people dressed up to go on a plane. Now everyone's in, a jogging suit and a puffer. It's like, and you can't tell what country anybody's from anymore, where before it was very distinct.
Yeah. No, there have been changes, but it's also very interesting how some of that 60s aesthetic and feeling, as we said at the beginning, really perpetuates in a positive way. We've got about 10 minutes. I wonder if anyone would like to ask our speakers some questions. We've got some microphones. If anyone would like a question, can you just put up your hand? Or if not, I can keep on talking. I'm happy to keep on talking. Anybody, any questions? There's one at the back there.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I'm interested in a lot of these smaller boutiques and some of the designers whose names aren't in the current vocabulary, like somebody like Tiger Morse. And I've tried to do some research on these designers, and there's very little information on JSTOR, on the Met website. Like, how would you recommend going about doing research on these designers who aren't as popular now?
Well, I think with Tiger Morse, she's actually, it was one of these coincidental things where, she was a legendary figure. There's very little of her output that has survived because she was so experimental in the materials that she chose to work in that, there are a few pieces at the Met and at Museum at FIT that are vinyl and they're toast. They're unstable materials, they're chemically, formulated, and they become gummy. People obviously did not preserve these things consciously. They wore them, they loved them, they were fun to dance in, and the body heat and fragrance and all of these other things really kind of contributed to their demise. But there was actually a scholar who contacted me who is fixated on Tiger Morse, and we kind of talked a little bit about what she actually accomplished and the fact that she was the first to open a boutique on Madison Avenue in 1955. And she was really an Upper East Side socialite. She was initially doing kind of Chanel, not copies, but knockoffs for some of the Upper East Side clientele who didn't quite want to go to Paris for Chanel. And she just kind of she started traveling a lot. She started bringing in exotic textiles. She did a few pieces for Jackie Kennedy out of exotic gifts of state that Jackie had received. And she gets involved with the drug culture and with Dr. Feelgood, and ultimately, after her death, she just kind of fell into obscurity. But I think that there are a lot of people now who really value the fact that she was really the one who was the groundbreaker of this whole thing, and the fact that they were small quantity, commodities, people who were in a position of being visible were wearing these things, and it's a difficult thing, but there are references, certainly even the Condé Nast archive, there are references in Vogue. We were able to find a direct reference to one of the pieces in the exhibition that was Tiger's Teeny Boppers, and it's January 1967, there it is, and the address, which is the label that we have in the dress. So there are means of doing it. It's a little, but we have more options to research now than we've ever had, so it's you just have to want to do it.
And all those Mark Shaw photographs that Alan put together.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, because that's the most I ever saw of her world. Yeah.
Well, that was Alan Rosenberg, who just, genius. He just, the wonderful thing about the world of fashion and fashion historians, people really, really become fixated on one thing, and it's an obsessive compulsive kind of impulse. And if you can find the person who is really fixated on the topic that you want to explore, you can't shut them up. You know, they'll come up with the references, they'll come up with the photographs, they'll come up, and it's great now because New York obviously is still the center of all of this insanity, and they're all here.
But I think that's such good advice, you know, that at least when one's looking at the 60s, there are still people, and it's like just following a trail of bread or something. People lead you to each other as well as sort of print resources, and Phyllis is obviously a great resource. So I think if you want to find out about, well, lots of things, but certainly Tiger Morse or others, they've got good resources just sitting here. I think there was another question that...
You alluded to it a little bit in artificial fabrics, but on one hand in the 60s there was this handcrafted thing, but also would you like to speak about like plastics that became cheap and colorful and molded, their influence on the 60s?
Well, you know, the plastics, it was part of being modern. I mean, it's in the first section of the exhibition, we have one man's look per platform. We didn't want to totally exclude men, but we really wanted to talk about women's fashion because it's a strength of our permanent collection. But the piece that we have is Brooks Brothers, but it's wash and wear. And it's very, very prominently labeled as wash and wear. And this was something that, you know, I mean, now we're so casual with wash and wear, that's nothing. That was a big deal. And for Brooks Brothers to really feature that as a selling point. And I think that, you know, all it took were to have a few designers who were prominently positioned start experimenting in materials that had never been available before, like vinyl. And by the end of the 60s, there's vinyl all over the place, whereas 1965, 64, 65, that's really the critical threshold where it becomes something that people were experimenting with. And because it was space age. You know, if Courrèges hadn't done the cutouts and done, well, okay, if you got a cutout, why not put a piece of transparent plastic there? You know, is that much more? And then, you know, also pop culture, and you've got Star Trek, and you've got a lot of the costumes that are suddenly very, very much in evidence on television, and they're doing all kinds of crazy things. And before we knew it, it was all mainstreamed into regular streetwear.
Have anything to say on plastic, Anna? Not your material.
Well, yeah, I was obsessed because I saw like a pinstripe plastic, yellow plastic with navy and maroon stripe peacoat and skirt and little handbag in 17 magazine. And of course, I begged my mother to buy it for me, and I had it. But it was like not many places to go in Detroit.
I wish we had a picture. There's also the one.
The outfit.
Oh, well, even better. You've also got in the exhibition the wonderful Mary Quant yellow boots, the ones that converted. So that's one great piece. I think there's another question at the front here.
You touched on the social mores of the 50s, the structured clothing, and it seems that Life magazine was really the first sort of bam where you saw the styles that then were translated into the street, and then Condé Nast was just like opening a world to a teenage girl in the 60s, you know. And just the being here and being present in the company of all of you is a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think every household got Life magazine or Look magazine.
Absolutely.
And that was, I looked forward to that because it educated you, and you knew like what the latest thing was. I think that's the first time I saw Baby Jane Holzer with the Warhol pictures projected, the films projected behind her. And certainly that's what made me want to go to Parsons. There was an article on Fonsegraves and Teal, and they graduated from Parsons, went to Paris, and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton opened a boutique for them. So I thought as a kid, I just have to go to Parsons. That's the secret. You know, it's like it's what educated me to the rest of the world.
Yeah. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Life magazine is available in its totality on Google Books, and it's great. I think we can have one last question, please. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
The 20th century had an awful lot of highly identifiable trends. The 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, of course, any number of, if you were to show me a photograph, I could probably say, within a few years of accuracy, this is from such and such period. I think maybe for the past 30 years, certainly for the past 18 years, and probably for a good 5 years before that, not so much. And maybe that's just me being sort of blind, but I wonder if any of you would like to comment on that, say yay or nay.
Well, I think that part of that is that the other eras had really identifiable characteristics that distinguished them, so that when you saw a 20s dress, you could, and they were formulaic. Again, you knew that if it's at knee length, it's 1925. If it starts descending to the back, it's getting toward 28, 29. 30, it goes back. So that, and it's always, each decade really had a curve. So that even in the 60s, Youthquake is 65. It's smack dab in the middle. 1830s, the biggest sleeves are 35, but by the time that the 60s and 70s come around, where, there are not all that many rules that are left to be broken, and there's that much more blending, so that, and certainly with the advent of sport clothing and hip hop and sweats and all of that, it's become a uniform, I think, of the world. And if we have an international uniform, then it's very difficult to date anything. I think that really, possibly now, if you see somebody with bright purple hair, you know that it's within the last year and a half or so. And yet, I met a woman 15 years ago who had magenta hair, Dan Goodman, who was a wedding dress designer, and it was the most startling thing I'd ever seen. Whereas now, we have people coming in here in their 80s, and they're coming in with green hair. So, but I don't think that there's really, Andrea, is there anything that you've noticed?
Well, I think sneakers, leggings, puffer jackets. I mean, it's kind of like now, it's, and I think this whole athleisure phenomena, it's in a different way, which it will always be in a different way. And I think that when you go back and look at this period, it's very identifiable.
I don't see it gelling in any way, though.
But are you talking more about silhouettes or the whole look?
I'm not sophisticated enough to say that. But as you pointed out, in the post-war period, post-World War II, everybody was reacting to rationing and the severity, etc. I'm kind of asking myself, what are we reacting to now? What brings all of this together? And I'm not coming up with anything.
I think within the last year, and I'm not going to go there, but I am seeing an awful lot of the vocabulary that was around in the late 60s. And a lot, it's like, okay, when was the last time we were really this angry? And so I'm noticing that it's easier to see clothing that's, I think it's more bohemian the past few years, and it's not going away. I think people are finding comfort in that, and I don't really know if ultimately the last time around there was a resolution to it, and there was a moment where the ceasefire in Vietnam was signed, and there were a few things that calmed down, and I think that there's possibly some optimism that it's talismanic, that if you go there again, maybe everything will calm down again. I don't know. I honestly don't.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of us reacting to a lot, but I think now that there just isn't one fashion anymore. We can have our fashion moment. We can be our fashion person depending on who we are and where we are, and we can have our tribe, which may be in Japan or in Morocco, and that might be different to the person we're sitting next to. We're all kind of dressed. Well, maybe we're dressed differently. Maybe we're dressed the same. Anyway, we've run out of time. I'd love to invite you all to have a drink with us and then to go and see the exhibition if you haven't. But before we leave, greatest of thanks to Andrea Aranow, Anna Sui, and Phyllis Magidson, and for you for coming. Thank you.
That was great, yeah. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
It was a real pleasure.
That was wonderful.
I was losing my mind.
That was wonderful.